Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor and privilege tonight to introduce His Excellency Yaroslav Olcha, the Ambassador of the Czech Republic to Korea since 2008. He's no ordinary diplomat. He's a scholar. He also published many books. And I think he's the one who used culture or literature as a means to promote friendly ties between Korea and Czech Republic. He also served as a Czech ambassador to Zimbabwe. That's right, Zimbabwe, for 6 years. And he also contributed considerably for promoting a democracy there through literature. For his contribution, he was awarded the Karma Prize. It's important prize, 2011. Ambassador Olcha majored Asian and African Studies at Charles University in Prague, and he served in diplomatic service for almost 20 years. So today he's going to speak on very unusual Korean who left some conspicuous footprints in Europe in the 30s and 40s, as well as in North Korea. So without further ado, let's welcome Ambassador Olcha with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I will speak about this man whose name is Han Hŭng-su. As you see, the photograph on the right-hand side is not very good. This is one of the two photographs we know. The photograph is fairly small. It's made on the highest mountain of the Czech Republic named Sněžka, probably in 1947. And the person who gave the photograph probably 11, 12 years ago to somebody else didn't want to see who is next to him and cut it out. That means we don't know who was there with him. He's a fairly mysterious person, and we will see why and what importance he had in the early Korean history. I will say a few words at the beginning how I found him, because I have a very big book collection of all the books of Asia and Africa. When I was appointed ambassador here and I knew I would be leaving for Korea in 2007, I went through my collection and put out all the books related with Korea. And one of them was the book, which is also here in the table, you will see there, which was a concise history of Korea published in Czech language in 1949 by Korean. And when I was talking to Korean experts, I was asking, oh, and what is that book? And they said, oh, he lived in Prague. I said, interesting topic. And what do you know about him? And I started finding that virtually nobody knows anything. Because each of the older persons who were 7 to 8 years old were saying something totally different than the other person. And it was very found very early that virtually they don't know. And I started thinking that this could be an interesting topic and looking into the man. And it was not going very much well, because we found some information in the Czechoslovak archives from the 1950s, but still it was very small information. Until I met the other person, professor at the University of Vienna, who is the call for my article in Transactions, who in fact had the same interest in him because he spent almost 5 years living in Austria. And we found that we combined our information from the German, Swiss, Austrian, Czechoslovak, Polish, and later on Korean archives with another professor here. We are creating the life and work of somebody who deserves a very important place in the history of Korea, but virtually nobody knows. As you see, born 1909 in Seong, died after 1959, question mark. When you look about Han Hŭng-su into today's literature, we will find not much information. You see, 1959, still the people remember him. In North Korea, there are two outstanding great historians, Cho Yu-ho, who will speak about it later on, and Han Hŭng-su, but their activities are, as of the time of writing, almost unknown. And there was various and various when we go closer and closer to today. 1991 book about the history of North Korean archaeology says, interesting thing, in the formative years of North Korean archaeology, there are two center figures, Cho Yu-ho and Han Hŭng-su. When we usually look on the history of archaeology in both Koreas, we hear that Cho Yu-ho is the father of North Korean archaeology. This is the fact which is usually used as a thing true, right. But when we look further on, we will find that in fact the father of North Korean archaeology is not Cho Yu-ho, but his younger colleague, but better educated, which is Han Hŭng-su, we will see later on. And you see also North Korean Research Center database said 1936 studied abroad in Czech. There was no Czech Republic, it was Czechoslovakia. He was not there in 1936. 1939, as Prague is occupied by Germany, he moves to the east. On the contrary, he moves to Czechoslovakia. There is all the information about him are virtually wrong and mistaken. The same is in the Czech Republic. Fairly important Czech Korean is Zdeněk Veslova, who is now almost 8 years old and who very well remembers all the people who met Han Hŭng-su before, is telling all the time virtually not two things. The question is why? Han lived in Czechoslovakia for 18 years. Oh my God, very illogical. Or here, wrongly state Han's date of birth, wrongly assume that Han and other Koreans, Harold's son, lived in Czechoslovakia since the late 1930s. That means these are the basic information which you can find usually in the literature. But who was really Han Hŭng-su? As I said, he was born in 1909 in Songdo or Kaesong. He was from a fairly well-off family. He was living in a two-story house. As we know, his father was probably a businessman. We don't know his name. We don't know his mother's name, but we know that he was well off. He studied his primary school in Kaesong, and he studied his secondary school as well there. There is no other information we know about his early childhood. What we know later on is that in 1930 he went, as a typical Korean of that time from a fairly well-off family, he went to study in Tokyo. He enrolled to Sophia University in Tokyo, and he spent there in and off in Korea and back in Japan for almost 6 years. This is probably nowadays the most mysterious part of his life, because that's the only thing we know from the very beginning. We know the year 1930, as he states in his CVs, which are known from our archives and Austrian archives, and we know that by 1936 he was not there. I have asked the president and archive of the Sophia University to find anything about his stay in Sophia University, and for our big surprise, after an initial very positive response, we received the answer that there is no evidence about his study at the university. There are many reasons why they found. Probably he was using some different Japanese name, one of the options, or there were some other reasons the part of the archive was destroyed. But the fact that they haven't found any single clue is, for me, a bit suspicious, because we know definitely that he was living and studying in Japan. He was a member of the Japanese Ethnographic Society, his name is mentioned there. That means we know he was there. And because he was extremely active, hard-working, and writing a lot, I can assume that we could one day find that he has published something in Japan, or he did something in Japan. We really don't know. What is definitely very probable is that he met many important personalities of Korean history there studying also. One of them was Baek Nam-un. Baek Nam-un is a crucial historian of the early North Korea or 1930s, 1940s Korean historiography, who was there then. And he is mentioning in many of his articles Baek Nam-un. There is a definite bond, either only scientific or even personal, between Han Hŭng-su and Baek Nam-un. And once the confirmation of that is virtually unknown. What we know for the first is that while he was coming back to Korea, he started archaeological research. In 1933, he published his very first article in left-wing magazine People, which was followed by 2 more articles and another article in the most important scientific magazine of that time, Hakpo. When you look on the list of the publication, you see a person who really writes serious scientific works. He is in that moment one of the very first Koreans writing very long, very thorough articles on ethnography, archaeology, and history. Once more, we can imagine that there might be even more such articles, but this shows his importance, I think, fairly well. But as once I say, we don't know much about his travels between Japan and Korea. What we know is that in March 1936, Kaesong office issued him a new passport, and he left Korea. He left for Austria. In Austria, he spent virtually 8-9 years. It depends on how we count it, because he was traveling across the whole parts of Central Europe. In more than 12 years he spent in Europe. We once more don't know, and we can only guess why he went to Austria, but there could be many reasons. One of them was that there was already one important historian and archaeologist there. It was already mentioned, Han Hŭng-su. Han Hŭng-su was already then for 1 year at the University of Vienna. Also, there were important experts in archaeology and prehistory working at the University of Vienna, and as he was already a fairly known person, he probably knew where he was going to go. We have plenty of various small information about his life from various documents at the University of Vienna. What is also important is to mention specifically that when we speak about the nationality, it's written Korean, although, of course, citizenship was made as Japanese. And we have plenty of people, plenty of information, and also information about what were his school results. As you see, his school results were excellent, except rising with the part which is devoted to prehistory, where he had not so good results, which is interesting because this was his topic. But also maybe the reason that his main and best professor was exactly that one, maybe caused the fact that he hasn't received so good admiration at the end. And as you see, he passed through the full courses of history, prehistory, and archaeology, and the results were excellent. Which we can compare with also Toyo. His results were not as good. We can fairly well trace his activities at Vienna. We also know all the addresses where Han Hŭng-su lived, what he was doing. That means we can have a fairly good information about that. First is the documentation of the university, and second is very good luck for us that he sent a couple of letters to Korea, describing first of all his travels from Korea via Moscow, Warsaw, Krakow, up to Vienna, and also a few letters about his early days in Vienna. The letters were published in Hakpo as the first place, and also in Choson Ilpo in that time. That means now we have an idea what he was doing. And he's mentioned, I'm together here with Brother Toyo, as we mentioned, and we are having a good time. Good. What we know that Han was quite eager to learn and focused on ethnology and prehistory. From the very beginning, he was mentioning, I made various excavations in Korea. I was going to the dolmen and menhir sites and made various results. Also, we see how focused on his scientific career he was. When he was traveling from Korea to Europe, he spent all his time in Moscow and in Krakow and Warsaw, meeting the historians, visiting the museums and making the notes, and trying to find the people. He met one of the Polish historians there, and he unfortunately says it in letter, I haven't persuaded him to do more in Korean history. I mean, this was his focus. He really wanted to do something for Korea and show it Korea. This is the mention of one of the two letters which was going to be on the door, which was published, which is fairly long and very thorough description of his style of working and thinking. And also there is a real travelogue which was published in the Czechoslovakia. In 1938, a very important change in European history happened, and as the World War II was coming closer, the Nazi Germany of Adolf Hitler occupied Austria. This caused a fairly big problem for Han Hŭng-su, which you can imagine, because the majority of his professors were Jews. And Jews were, of course, not in the best position, and they tried to move out, and some of them succeeded to move out from Austria. That was a very good situation, a very good luck of his main professors who moved over to Switzerland. And we can guess, but once more, the guess is very probable that because he hasn't finished his education, Han Hŭng-su moved with them to Switzerland. He spent in Switzerland virtually 3 semesters, which is something like almost 2 years. First of all, he enrolled on the University of Bern, where he finished his formal education, and for the last semester he moved to the University of Fribourg, where he finalized his PhD. In Switzerland, as I said, he met and he regained the friendship with the Wilhelm Schmidt, Hugo Obermeier, who were with him in Vienna, and also met Otto Chu, one of the crucial archaeologists of Switzerland. After he finished his Vienna, Japanese, and Swiss universities, he was probably the best person, the best educated Korean in this very specific field. When you look once more on the number of the PhD holders who received their PhD in Europe, there was virtually a handful of Koreans who received a full-fledged PhD, and Han Hŭng-su was among them. He was also probably the first or the second Korean who ever received PhD in Switzerland. And also you see how his PhD was evaluated. He really liked it and wrote more and more. He was really a kind of a probably person who needed to write. There is one of probably more articles, we haven't found many of them. This is the travelogue, which is named In Fribourg, which was published in 1941 in another Korean magazine. We can imagine that various other magazines run other short pieces of Han Hŭng-su, but once more, this is the thing for study. His PhD was very, very well evaluated, and thanks to this we have final results which are very good, and also by a good coincidence we do have 2 copies of his PhD. Surprisingly, none of them is in the Fribourg University. One was found in Vienna and the other was found in Leiden University in the Netherlands. One of the typical questions is, and we asked the Leiden University how the manuscript got up to Leiden, and we can't find it because that's the only connection of Han Hŭng-su with the Netherlands. But because he was a very much traveling person, we can imagine that he might go to the Netherlands from Fribourg before the World War II really started. It could be possible, or he had some contact there. But once more, we don't know much about it. But I specifically show his PhD and the manuscript of PhD, which are fairly different in a way, which we have the copies of it. What is the most important on his early work, his PhD, is the fact that in comparison with many other historians, Han Hŭng-su learned many languages. What we know now is that he of course spoke Korean. He spoke Japanese. He was able to read and write and speak Chinese. He learned German, French, English, and Czech, which is a fairly big surprise for the Korean of the 1930s and 40s. One of the signs of his ability to use both the Eastern and Western historical sources is his PhD. When you see, this is a very introductory chapter, which is also published in Transactions, which tries to summarize the whole history of study of megaliths in Korea. What is more important is that we look on the bibliography. We have a Korean text in Chinese, we have all the European texts. When we go further on, we see all the classical texts by Europeans and Americans from Joseon, Underwood, Hilbert, Bishop. When we go further on, we see more. We have a Japanese text on Korean prehistory, we have a French text on Korean prehistory, and at the end we have also a German text. His ability to study was probably enormous, and it was extremely untypical for that period. Once more, when we look, for example, to Baek Nam-un, who wrote those important books in the 1930s, he was rarely using many Western materials. He was probably the only person, Han Hŭng-su, who really did that in those years. We have many question marks about Switzerland. Imagine the situation. It was the early 1940s. The World War II was going on. It was very visible that the situation in Europe is getting more and more complicated. Switzerland was that island where you can easily survive. But Han Hŭng-su left Switzerland immediately after he finished his PhD, although, as he mentioned, he was working as an assistant of one of his professors. It is very questionable why he did that, because that was the best place. He was a PhD student, he had the best marks, he had everything. There are some question marks which are coming back from the archives of the late 1940s from Czechoslovakia, where another person is mentioning about Han Hŭng-su that he was in a close relations with the Swiss communists, and because of his relationship with the Communist Party of Switzerland, he was expelled from Switzerland. We can imagine that could be true, because from the very beginning, Han Hŭng-su was a typical left-wing Korean intellectual, and his relation to the left was more and more visible in his later years. We know that he left for Berlin, where probably he met many other people from the Korean side. He probably met Imi Rock, the famous Korean writer who published in German. We know it because Imi Rock was later on, when Han Hŭng-su was in Czechoslovakia, published in Czech, which might be the link which we miss. And he also went to Stettin, nowadays Stettin in Poland. In fact, at the end, after going to Berlin and looking around, Han Hŭng-su came to an idea that it's really time to go back to Korea. And when you look on all the Koreans who were in Europe in the late 1930s, significant majority of them left back to Korea when the war erupted. It was the case of Toyu-ho, his colleague, who came to Seoul and later on he lived in the North Korea. It was the case of famous painter In Song. It was the case of majority of the Koreans who haven't had a very deep roots in the society. He bought a ticket, he packed 28 crates of his books and belongings and sent it via Stettin towards Moscow to go via Trans-Siberian Railway. He had only one small problem. He bought a ticket which was valid 2 days after the Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. That means he couldn't get out. In one moment he was caught in the middle of the war, and all his crates and all his belongings were somewhere in Stettin. In that moment, Stettin was already the part of Nazi Germany, and he received the information that police wants to search it. There was a small problem. Inside there were hundreds of books, many of them written by Jews. Many of them were the books which were not allowed for distribution in the Nazi Germany, and as it is mentioned, there was also a communist literature. He didn't know what to do, and he said the only chance how to save his life and also his belongings to travel to the port in northern Poland. He got there and he persuaded the person who was in charge of the things that really, in fact, there is nothing problematic in the boxes. Could you please send it to me back to Switzerland? And the man, being persuaded by Han Hŭng-su, really did that, hasn't opened it, and sent the back to Switzerland. We really don't know what happened to the boxes. We don't know what happened to the manuscripts. We know it came back. But as we discussed before, it is very probable that he was not allowed to go back to Switzerland. What he could do, the only other place where he had a context was Vienna. That means he returned back to Vienna, and because he had all these PhDs, all this knowledge, he was occupied by the Museum in the Völkerkunde, which was the top ethnographical museum in Central Europe. It was not an easy job because he was receiving a very small, meager salary. He had not a very good perspectives because the situation in Europe was complicated. But when you look on his assessment of work, we see something really unique. He is a real expert in East Asian languages and scripts. He is an extraordinarily efficient, both museum-wise and scientifically. A model in terms of discipline. Only expert of the Chinese, Korean, and Japanese languages and scripts. This is the final one of 3 different assessments of his work. He is fully indispensable. This was the assessment of his work, but still, he was not on the full-fledged payroll. He had not a good situation in Vienna. He didn't know what to do and how long he would receive his money there, and he had to find something else, the other option to survive. In one moment in Vienna, he met a woman. She was older than him. She was probably recently divorced. She was an artist speaking excellent German. She was in fact of Czech origin, born on the territory of Poland, and she was a real artist. And we can guess if he fell in love with her then or later on. But we'll come back to that. But before, his context resulted in Vienna in the fact that he has received even a higher degree than PhD. He was habilitated by the University of Vienna, which is totally rare thing, and we can find really a few Koreans who received habilitation in Europe in the 1930s. And his significant 70 pages long work about the economic structure of Far East was published in German, written and also in German. But as I said, he probably fell in love. And she was a person from Prague. As I said, born in Poland, living in Prague, working in Vienna, having divorced from a German husband, artist. And he found that there is a fairly good group of experts in Far East languages and culture in Prague, and he came to Prague in 1942. What he was doing there, he taught languages, and once more, he was teaching Japanese and Chinese, and he was allowed to teach Korean in a moment when still Korea was subjugated to Japan, in a country which was an ally of Japan and Germany, and he was still allowed to teach Korean. The very, very unique thing which happened. Other thing that he was starting cataloging all East Asian collections by various museums in Prague, because they had never had such a great expert with the knowledge of art archaeology. And he was working on a group of exhibitions. The biggest one was the exhibition of Japanese art and art industry, which was opened by a consul general in Japan in Prague in 1942. And it was heralded by the occupying authorities as a great chance to show a very great Japanese ally culture in Central Europe. But he also started writing, translating, and starting commuting between Prague and Vienna. While the previous years of his life were more about development of his skills, the 5 years he spent in Prague were the top and the best for his work. He worked partly in this museum, which is still existent, the Nápestec Museum of Asian and African and American Cultures, which is still in Prague. He was cataloging the collection there, and he met really important person, Jaroslav Krušek, who was a leading Czech sinologist whose works on Chinese medieval literature were published numerous times in English as well. He studied Byzantology, turned to Chinese and Japanese. Before World War II, studied Göteborg, Halle, Leipzig, Beijing, and Tokyo. And he was in Tokyo in the same moment as Han Hŭng-su. Maybe they met there, but honestly, we don't know. He taught Chinese and Japanese, but when Han Hŭng-su arrived to Prague, he found that he's better in Chinese and Japanese than him, and he was helping him teaching. 1945, after the independence of Czechoslovakia and Nazi Germany was defeated in the World War, he became the leading force behind the whole Czech Oriental Studies, established the Department of Far Eastern Studies at the university, and he was the director of the Orient Institute, a big institution in charge of Asia and Africa. Krušek became a lifelong friend of Han Hŭng-su, and he was probably the person who was covering his study of Korean. He was also taught Korean by Han Hŭng-su. When Han Hŭng-su arrived, he lived in that lovely, beautiful villa. And this was the view from in front of the villa. That was a fairly good place, one of the best places in Prague. In fact, that was the villa which one of the American famous Hollywood actors wanted to buy in Prague, and we haven't sold it to him. Because it's a historical monument really in the heart of Prague. This was the place where he was probably sitting, writing his first books. And he was living there with Huberta Algervis, that was the lady he met in Vienna, and he fell in love with her. As you see, this is the document from the early 1940s, and the photo shows that she was a fairly pretty lady. When we speak about her, she is definitely at least 25% of Han Hŭng-su's success. She was his proofreader, she was helping him in writing German and changing the text, and he was also promoting his work and translating it into Czech language later on. And she also had so many contacts in Prague, both in the times of the Nazi occupation, because as I said, her former husband was German medical doctor, and also after the independence of Czechoslovakia, because she was well known by everybody in the society. Thanks to her, we have also hundreds of pages of Han Hŭng-su manuscripts. These are two samples of a very typical manuscripts which were kept accidentally until very recently. As you see, the manuscripts are really many typo scripts with many handwritten notes, definitely by Huberta Algervis. Thanks to these manuscripts, we have an idea of the scope of his work, because we found that only 1/3 of his real work was very published. Maybe mention in a few words about the manuscripts. The manuscripts were kept by the friend Huberta for all her life, and she died at the age of 92 in the 1990s. And before she died, she gave the pile of the papers, there was nothing else than the pile of papers, to leading Czech Koreanists, who kept it in the box. And when I started talking about Han Hŭng-su, that we want something, she said, "Oh, I have that pile of papers. If you want, you can look on it." And I spent some 2 weeks trying to put together the pages, loose lying pages, and what I found was that it was really a treasure trove of almost 1,000 pages of full books, translations, virtually unknown text, originally from the 1930s, 1940s. As I said, he was fairly active during the Nazi occupation. He was so active that even the people who had no idea heard about something going on in this villa. And this famous Czech writer mentions the villa as a Manchurian consulate. It's funny why, because he knew that it's not Japanese, he knew it's not Chinese, and he had no idea about the Koreans. That means he supposed it's Manchurian. It says that presence of a Korean in that villa was very, very visible. The situation changed surprisingly for years after Soviet forces occupied Prague and Nazi Germany collapsed and Czechoslovakia became once more independent. The problem was very easy. the villa where they lived was nationalized, but was taken over by the Nazis in 1941. And also there was a German citizen living in the house that was the friend of Han Hŭng-su. Another problem was that he was a Japanese citizen, another losing power of the war. And that's why in the very early days the villa was looted and attacked by the Red Guards, and the people were taken to jail, as we understand. But very soon his pro-communist friend helped him and came immediately in his protection and saved everything. This didn't help, and there was even 2 articles in the Czech press attacking them, as you see. The Koreans in the meantime became so intimate with her, means a German citizen, that one of them married that enemy woman. Once more, all was solved. There was a big problem. She was German, and she was supposed to leave Czechoslovakia as a retribution act where all the Germans, or majority of Germans, were removed from Czechoslovakia. In the same moment, she didn't want to leave, and he didn't want her to. But he had a problem. He was probably married. That means he brought another Korean man from Vienna who married her instead of him. In the 1940s, we see that villa is the heart of Prague, where there is an interesting group of people living. There is a divorcee German living with one Korean and married to the other. And there was a very small group of Korean people which became fairly more influential. The independence of Czechoslovakia allowed Han Hŭng-su to start promoting Korea, the thing which he was doing before as well, but more in a clandestine form, teaching Korean. Now, from the 1945 on, there is a huge number of articles, speeches, lectures being delivered by Han Hŭng-su on Korea. All of them are very pro-Korean, very nationalistic, and also promotional. This is one of the earliest one, which says, what you don't know about us, you is Koreans. And not only that he wrote the text in German and was translated into Czech, but also he made the illustrations himself. We even have the origin of that illustration in our files. And you see more and more such articles. Once more Korea, a cultural life of a Korean nation. And there is another photo of his on the very small corner. Once more, the photo doesn't say much about him, but the quality of the photo is adequate to print. Another side. Asia speaks about Asia, independent Korea. Many such articles, and once more, there might be more and more articles scattered across the press in Czechoslovakia. When you look, this is the list of all the texts we found in the Czechoslovakia. And he was covering all the things from highly scientific works like Homo pekinensis or Huang Herifer, the cradle of East Asian culture, up to the promotional text for average reader. And also he wrote about Japan, China, and the whole Far East. The most important part of the work comes in 1947. He was definitely working on his most important work, which was the history of Korea. This is the title page of the manuscript, which was until 2 months ago understood as lost. We surprisingly found a manuscript in the archive of the former East German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is incredible thing that somebody in East German Foreign Affairs Ministry understood the text as valuable that they put it into their library. And because the copies are so destroyed, we see the people were reading the text, because it was the only German language text of history of Korea available in the 1940s, 1950s. It was never published in German. It was only published as a Czech edition under the title Korea Yesterday and Today. And in the second edition in 1953, which has a very brand new 27 pages covering the times of the Korean War. The book is very thorough, and you can see the whole structure and contents of the book. He really covered every single part of the book. The whole book is approximately 350 pages long in the manuscript form, and it has many quotes, and it is really, from the point of view of today, when the historians look, it's still fairly unaware, except of some small things. But Han Hŭng-su was not only interested in history, he wanted to promote Korean literature. In fact, in his manuscript files, we found something like 300 pages of translations of contemporary Korean literature into German. Majority of them never published. The only thing which was published is a very tiny book of fairy tales and legends from Korea, published by an obscure publishing house in Vienna, which is fairly often to be found, as I was told by my Austrian colleague, on a book market there. And this book created his interest, because he said, who is that man? And he had the same experience as I. He was asking, who is that man, Hŭng-su Han? And everybody said, we have no idea. And he started the same study. What we found in the manuscript is an anthology of contemporary modern Korean literature translation into German, which was never published. It is an incredible thing that we have really important writers from the 1930s period translated into German, up to the early writers by North Korea, from North Korea. If this was published, it would be probably the first anthology of contemporary Korean literature published ever any place in Europe or America. He was also translating dramas. There is a drama by Saryang. There is a novel. We can't find what is the novel because we have only page 60 to 120. We don't have the end of the novel. We don't have the beginning of the novel. But we know that's the whole novel. And we are trying to find what kind of contemporary Korean novel it is. And he also still taught Korean. And because of him, Czech Republic has the long history of Korean studies. He met a man whose name was Ulter, who became later on the first Czechoslovakian, and he learned Japanese and Korean from him. He established the basis of Korean studies, and he became the head of the first Korean chair. And he translated 3 books from Korean. All of them, all the time, with the help of some Korean who lived then in Prague. He was also the author of the very first textbook of Korean. This is the textbook published in 1949 in Czech, and this is the second updated edition from 1954. This book was also immediately afterwards translated into German and published, and was used until the 1960s as the sole textbook of Korean in communist bloc, except for the Soviet Union. And he is also, and Han Hŭng-su was also behind the translation of the very first Korean contemporary novel into any European language. It was Kim Nam-chon, Teham. It was published in 1947, when Kim Nam-chon was still not an important North Korean promoter, and it is a shortly abbreviated version, and it was really translated by both Alois Ulter into Czech and Han Hŭng-su, and they were doing it via German, which was their common language. This is the first edition, and this is the second edition from the early 1950s. And he also pushed more. There is a selection of Korean fairy tales which were translated from German and Japanese by somebody else. Once more, the man behind pushing the publication of the book was Han Hŭng-su. He was promoting Korean literature in Czechoslovak radio. There is a script from the Czechoslovak radio of a fairy tale which was used in the 1940s. This is a drama which was used for the schools. I mean, his influence was incredible. And another person who taught is still alive, and he is, as I see here, a life member of Royal Athletic Society. In fact, he is the person, the only one of 2 last persons who met Han Hŭng-su in Czech Republic. In fact, he doesn't want to speak about him, and I think that he doesn't remember much. As you see his life, he was for a long time working for the diplomatic service, but in the same moment wrote the books about Korean art, which is here on the table, and translated classical Korean literature. And he was also 91 to 94 diplomat of Czech embassy. So that's why he's a Asiatic Society member. We have also a few drawings, original ones, which Han Hŭng-su did, and also probably his self-portrait, but we don't know. And the other part of his life was that he brought more and more Koreans. And when you look on the names, it's becoming more and more interesting. The first person is a virtually unknown person who disappeared soon after he came with an architect, wrote an article about Korean architecture. The only article we don't have the copy, and it was probably not published. The second person is more interesting. It's Han Hŭng-su, daughter of Reverend Hyun, a close friend of Han Hŭng-su, the first North Korean Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she was spiritual executive in North Korea around 1955-56 after she became the personal assistant of Han Hŭng-su. She spent almost 12 months in Czechoslovakia teaching Korean and working there. In Czechoslovakia there was also her son, Wellington Chong, who received a scholarship and he stayed in Prague and other cities for approximately 10 years. After his mother was put into jail at Han Hŭng-su, he became under the hit list of the North Korean embassy, probably, as we know from the diplomatic notes. When the North Korean embassy in Czechoslovakia was asking, do you know the whereabouts about Wellington Chong? And we didn't know much and we didn't tell them. What is interesting is that he disappeared without a trace from our point of view. One day he's not there, and what is even more interesting is Alice Hyun's brother, a famous historian, wrote about him in his memoirs on repeated occasions. And everything he writes in his memoirs is blatant lie. That means we can ask how it is possible. And we can say that probably the truth was significantly different than it is described in the book. And the last person who is still alive is Harold Sun, who is still living in the United States, and he was the last of that group of Koreans brought to Czechoslovakia by Han Hŭng-su, and he was a co-author of one of the translations of North Korean literature, and he also mentioned his life in Czechoslovakia and Han Hŭng-su in his memoirs published 15 years ago. And now we have the final stage of his life. 1948, he leaves Czechoslovakia and goes to North Korea, as everybody who wanted to do something for the left-wing New Korea. He had some friends in Pyongyang who helped him. Toyuho, his young fellow student, who was also interpreter during the truce talks in family John and Keston, he studied historian and who was buried in the 1960s. Kim Nam-chun, we already mentioned, buried during the Korean War at the end, like Han Hŭng. And we have all the other names. That means, as Tatiana Gabrusenko last week mentioned when she commented on my article transaction, she said, okay, we spoke about it, and yes, he was practically doomed from the very beginning. Yes, he was. He had a bad start. What we know, in July 1948, he probably taught at Innocent University, but in November 1948, he was promoted to the chairmanship of a fairly influential commission, and he became the big boss of Korean historical sites, monuments, museums, and archaeology. Until the Korean War, as Korean historian Lee Ki-song knows, he was the person who presented guidelines, not Don Kong. But he was also promoting Czechoslovakia, his second life. In 1949, he published an important communist book in North Korean edition. It's the book of a very curious author who was a communist journalist and who was killed in a Nazi German jail because of his cooperation with the communists. This is more about his book. What is interesting is that it was published in virtually every significant language in the world, supported by the Czechoslovak communist government until 1980s. In the case of North Korea, that was not the case. It was really only published by the North Korean authorities. And because it was the heroic story of a man who died in a jail, it was very much similar to those books which were published. What is more interesting is the connotation with South Korea. We have two different South Korean editions of that quintessential Czechoslovak communist book. The second edition published last year. And I can only guess why such a book was published. And also the second question, is it the censored edition of the communist or the non-censored published edition? And I guess it's still the censored edition. And Han Hŭng-su, of course, published also scientific articles. Once more, we know about 4 of them, and we know but never saw copies of at least 3 more articles we know only as a bibliographic quotes. But as we don't have the magazines to come up with. And maybe the most important part of it is that Han Hŭng-su came to Seoul in July 1950. It seems to be that he arrived soon after the occupied North Korean field, and because he was the head of the all Korean historical sites, of course, all the Seoul historical sites became part of his responsibility at that moment. And we can only think that he was definitely going to South Korea's National Museum, because some of the then South Korea's National Museum stuff sided with the occupying North Korean authorities. What is the most interesting is that he had a friend. And when we look on this, we see that the director, the founding father of the South Korean National Museum was another schoolmate and colleague of Toyuho and Han Hŭng-su, Kim Chae-won. And it's interesting that we can guess if they met or hadn't met. That's a big question mark. We don't know, and there is no clue on that because Kim Chae-won is not mentioned in any single sentence the existence of Han Hŭng-su, while Han Hŭng-su is mentioned in his manuscript Kim Chae-won. We can guess how it was. In 1950, the situation for Han Hŭng-su could change for better. There was a Czechoslovak embassy opened in 1950, shortly before the Incheon landing, unfortunately for them. This is one of the first and last photos of the Czechoslovak embassy in Pyongyang because it was evacuated, because before it was evacuated to the North Korean mountains on the Chinese border. There was a lot of support for Korea. There is a cover of a very crazy book published in Czech language in the 1950s. There is a big meeting in favor of Korea and hence of Korea in the National Theatre in Prague in 1951. And around North Korea you could see the Czechoslovak buses Skoda, Czechoslovak trucks Tatra. The Czechoslovak presence became increasingly important because Czechoslovakia became the 3rd biggest donor to North Korea after China and Soviet Union. Also, we built hospitals and many other things. Many more such. The orphans, North Korean orphans and students lived in Czechoslovakia. The situation could be for Han Hŭng-su the best possible. Support of the North Korean cinema. There is even a famous North Korean actress and dancer taking part in one of the biggest film productions in Czechoslovak socialism. Cinematography in 1952. There was an open door when he could use that Czechoslovak connection. And also from 1953 we had soldiers and diplomats in Hangzhou. But he couldn't use them much. We don't know much about his late life. We know that probably he was in Beijing after the Americans attacked and everybody evacuated from Pyongyang. We know that he met one Czech in May 51. He published an article we don't know about because Miuju Chosov is not available in South Korea. He wrote 27 pages of his book. In May he met a Hungarian journalist, Igor Meray, who is still alive, and in early 52 he led Austrian communists. That's all we know. We know that after 1952 he disappears. We don't know where, we don't know how, we don't know what happened to him. And as one of the early Czechoslovak diplomats in Pyongyang stated in a letter to me, everybody knew that he disappeared, and it was not very wise to ask about his whereabouts. That I haven't asked. Okay, and very frankly, even his closest friends were starting to forget him. This is the introduction to the textbook of Korean, 1949 edition. Material which is in this book, I collected for a couple of years in cooperation with Han Hŭng-su at Kim Il-sung University, Ellis Hyon, etc., etc. The second edition, 5 years later, says, the material which is in this book I have collected in occasional meetings with some Koreans who lived in Praha for a short time. Okay. That says very clearly the fact that the communist Czechoslovakia was very civil. They had to forget about them, which says that all of them knew what happened to them. Unfortunately, they never shared that information, what happened to them and did to them. And because of Han Hŭng-su, Prague University, Charles University became the second university in Europe with the MA program in Korean studies after St. Petersburg in 1950. London came 8 years later, Paris came 5 years later. And because of that, there was the whole first generation of people who learned and worked in favor of Korea. As you see, there was plenty of various books published in the early 50s, and all these people were usually the students of Han Hŭng-su. Without Han Hŭng-su, there would not be a Korean studies in our country. Thank you very much.
I think Ambassador also can entertain a few questions if you may have.
I'm just curious, do you think that he may have fallen victim in the first purge of the Kim Il-sung in 1954?
I would say that it is more probable that he was not the victim of the very first version because he was not so influential. If he was so influential, he would be on the list of the early version. That is, we have the lists where also Ellis Hyon is on the list of the first big purge with Paronion. He probably somehow disappeared partly, to disappear more partly later on, to disappear fully later on. There is a discussion which is once more unconfirmed that he became a victim also of a heated discussion with his friend Toyuho, and Toyuho helped him, but these are all the speculation based on the secondary information from somebody who heard from somebody else.
Okay, so question anyway, thank you.
No question.
Currently in Prague, in either Charles University or the University of Prague, how active is there a Korean studies program, one? And if there are such programs, to what extent are the writings and research and other things of Han Hŭng-su used and researched and subject of study?
There is if I'm not mistaken, in the last 5 years there is 20 to 30 students, in every single year of Korean studies in Charles University. There is a group of active professors and approximately, let's say, 3-4 books translated from Korean are being published every year. The most recent, was a complete edition of Han Hŭng-su, which was published in Czech late last year. The first volume of Ko's Manimbo is coming this year, and this week the leading Czech publishing house will sign a cooperation with LTI of Korea for starting the whole series of contemporary Korean literature, which will start later this year. I mean, that's a lot of things.
More specifically, there's so much about Han Hŭng-su in respect of archaeology and that. And are there archives or anything in Prague at all?
We took everything which we could find in the archives. And as I said, Han Hŭng-su was in a way in the 1950s, 60s, 70s forgotten by purpose. And now he's virtually unknown. This article in Transactions and this presentation is the first such a presentation of his life in a concise way. That means now he is becoming a part of Czech Korean life.
You say something a bit more about the English translation of his dissertation. And that was mentioned by somebody in America or something.
Yes. There is a English, very rough English translation of his dissertation, which is signed 1940, which was found. I think that was the one found in Leiden Library, but I'm not now sure perfectly. Or no, in Vienna University. And it is quoted by another Royal Asiatic Society Life member, James Hoyt, who wrote an article in American Anthropologist only about this Han Hŭng-su article. It's like a totally illogical thing that somebody who doesn't exist has one specific article devoted to his PhD in American Anthropologist. And the questions are, James Hoyt is mentioning that he is using Han Hŭng-su's Korean language article, but it seems to be he was using the English language translation. But we don't know who did the English language translation. We assume that because of the quality of language, it might be Han Hŭng-su himself, that he might publish it, he wanted to publish it in Switzerland, but because he left, he couldn't publish it. But we have no idea. It doesn't fit into the whole other manuscripts of his. Nothing else in English.
Your Excellency, thank you for your presentation. Do we have any evidence that Han Hŭng-su was acquainted with E. Lieder, the other famous Korean who lived in German and wrote in Germany, introducing Korean stories in German?
With a very limited number of Koreans living, especially in the late 1930s in Europe, and we know that he was in contact with many of them and that he was traveling around. He was in Berlin. It's very illogical that he would never meet in Europe. On the contrary, we have an indirect confirmation that they knew each other by the fact that when Han Hŭng-su arrived to Prague, the same magazine which published his first article also published 2 years before a translation of part of E. Smith into Czech. Once more, he had to brought it probably to Prague to attention of the publisher.
Okay.
A quick question. Does the journey end here or does it start here? And you said he's not known in Korea whatsoever, so do you expect or will you be promoting him or what's going to happen to Han Hŭng-su in Korea?
We plan, first of all, to edit all his Czech language writing, which is available in manuscript in a book which will be named Father and Mother of Czech Korean Studies, which will be mainly the text of his and his mother, Huberta. The Austrian professor is planning to edit the German language translations of contemporary Korean literature, which was never seen. I mean, there will be such 2, hopefully, books in, let's say, 1 year time. And logically, the best option would be to have a complete writing of Han Hŭng-su published in Korean, because it will, for the first time, show really the scope of the writing. The problem is that those who can read Korean in 1930s magazine have absolutely no idea that there are the articles in Czech language. Those who are interested in translations of Korean literature in German don't know about his archaeological experience, etc. I mean, there is a problem that is unknown because of the fact that nobody ever put together the whole life and whole work together.
Let's give a big
Thank you very much.